Deciding what to watch on family movie night can be a source of contention, but did you ever consider choosing a movie based on your astrological sign? In the summer of 2025, the streaming giant Netflix launched an astrology hub that allows you to do just that.
Entertainment journalist Liz Coken, writing for CNET, seemed happy with the curated options offered her as a Sagittarius with a taste for adventure. Critic Stuart Heritage, however, writing for The Guardian, was unimpressed with what was served up to him as a Leo with, apparently, main character energy.
So does this mean that Sagittarius is less picky than Leo, or that astrology is a pseudoscience that just happens to hit the mark sometimes? Some say you shouldn't seek astrological guidance at all. Not from Netflix or anyone. Jen Nizza, host of the Ex-Psychic Saved podcast, claimed that Netflix's new hub is perilous. Nizza said, "These companies are pushing out a demonic practice which does plant seeds in people's minds and does open doors to demons."
The Catholic Magisterium also warns against reading horoscopes. It lists astrology among other divination practices that Catholics should reject, not because we'll end up possessed, but because these practices, quote, conceal a desire for power over time, history, and, in the last analysis, other human beings, as well as a wish to conciliate hidden powers. They contradict the honor, respect, and loving fear that we owe to God alone.
But does this refer to all uses of astrology? Would the church frown on using the Netflix hub to pick a movie, or reading your horoscope in the newspaper for fun? What about people who approach astrology not out of a desire to control or penetrate hidden mysteries, but just for self-understanding? Should Catholics read their horoscopes? That's what we're going to discuss on this episode of the podcast.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask, but not so easy to answer.
Hi, Emily. How are you today?
I'm good. I will admit that astrology is not my topic. I was trying to think about this and I realized I don't even know the sign of my spouse or child. I'm an Aries. So this is clear that this is not something I think about a lot.
So I am the opposite. I'm far from being an expert on astrology, which is, I guess a good thing. But my family was, very, there were hippies in the family, and there was a sun sign book lying around. And I remember, I think I was in my late teens, maybe. I picked it up, and I had always thought that I was a Capricorn, and I was reading it, and I was learning that I was on the cusp, and I was an Aquarius, and I was suddenly like, oh my gosh, this makes so much more sense. And I spent years just thinking, oh, I'm an Aquarius. That makes so much sense. And then I read something else, and it informed me that I'm actually a Capricorn after all. And then I started thinking, well, you know what? That makes sense too. And I think that the way these are written, you can often find yourself in many a description because our personalities shift so much.
I also think, I don't know if my parents would admit it now, but I do think growing up, they had a little bit of that evangelical fear around astrology or some of these other practices associated with the occult, that somehow we were just going to, it wasn't that they were superstitious. It wasn't that they thought demons were going to come. It was just, why risk it? Right.
I think your parents seem to have had a sensible approach because it really can, people get very into it. And so from my perspective, I'm like, oh, well, this is just a fun little thing I'm doing. Why would anyone say that's harmful? But I can totally understand why the Catechism says what it says.
Well, and it turns out that people have thought a variety of things about astrology since there were people, right? Since before there was a church. And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the podcast. The origins of astrology, how Christianity has engaged with ideas about astrology over the centuries, and what the Catholic Church has to say about the matter today. I'm Emily Santa, one of the hosts of Glad You Asked.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. Before we get into the interview, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now, back to the question of the day: should Catholics read their horoscopes?
To help us answer this question, we talked to Luis Campos Ribeiro. He's a historian of art and of science with a focus on astrology, astronomy, and their connections to art, especially in the medieval and early modern eras.
He has a doctorate degree in history and philosophy of sciences from the University of Lisbon. He has written multiple articles and two books on the heavenly spheres and Jesuit astrology, prognostication, and science in early modern culture.
Luis, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
This is such a fun topic we're discussing because astrology and the horoscope have come to take on this whole kind of like entertainment dimension in Western culture. And a lot of people play around with it just kind of for fun. But then there's just some other people who take it very seriously and they'll consult astrology for business guidelines or for dating advice. How was astrology originally understood?
Well, astrology was, I would say, part of the cosmology. So it was understood as a fact in ancient times that there was some kind of correlation between movements of the stars and the planets and events on Earth. And that would influence, well, at a very early stage, it would have a religious connotation, of course. And then it started to have a prediction. You know, you would predict what the gods would have to say or what they want by the movements of the planets. And then later on, we were talking about Babylonia in very, very ancient times. And then as mathematics evolved and people started to perceive that there's a cycle to these movements have a specific cycle, then you could predict where those planets were going to be. So you could anticipate an event. And very early on, this was used for, I would say, mainly for weather forecasting, so meteorology, crops, the success of crops, and of course, political things. You know, would the king be okay? Would you win the war? Would you be successful, you know, in your reign? So that is the very early use of astrology. It's a bit later that goes into the more personal aspects that we see nowadays, which are extremely common.
So, do we know anything about how long people have been using astrology, when people actually started looking to the stars in this way?
Well, that's a very good question and a difficult one to answer, because when do we start to call whatever people are doing astrology? So you have what I would call a sort of astro religion, you know, where you are worshipping the planets and the stars and the sky and nature itself as a whole, as you see in ancient religions. And then these systems, which we now call astrology, start to be developed. And I think the early aspects of this go to around 10 centuries before Christ. And astrology as we know it, you know, with the chart, the horoscope, and that kind of thing, that is 2 to 3 centuries before Christ. So by the time of Alexander the Great and a bit later on, the astrology as we know it starts to develop, or it starts to appear, as far as we are aware, because of course the the older you get, the less documentation you have regarding this.
Most of us in the United States are familiar with the Greco-Roman horoscope. You know, I know I'm a Capricorn Aquarius, and we might be familiar with the Chinese horoscope, even if it's just from the menus in Chinese restaurants. So we have this kind of very surface awareness of some of this. But what other horoscopes are there? Are other cultures out there that have done astrology in the past?
Well, again, it's difficult to be completely precise about this, and I don't want to leave anything out that is obvious, but astrology as we know it is a very, I would say, Middle Asian European thing. You know, it appears what we know of the roots, let's say, of Western practice of astrology come from the Middle East, and then they spread out through Egypt, Rome, Europe in general, and then evolved from there. And of course, they're going to move also to the east, and they're going to go to India, and then developed throughout in reaching Japan in the Middle Ages. So there's a long history. So that specific system has that spread out. Of course, it's going to be affected by culture. So cultures and different perspectives are going to change it considerably. And that's the kind of horoscopy or practice of astrology that we know. That's the roots. Chinese, for example, which is also very well known, it's called astrology, but if we are going to be very precise, that's not exactly astrology, because most of what we see there is based on a fixed calendrical system, which is called the 5 pillars, if I'm not committing any major error here. And it is a completely different system. It's called astrology because it's similar, but it's something. It has in common the 12 animals, the 12 signs, 12 animals, but it's a whole different system. We do have Indian astrology, which is a variation of the same root as our European-based astrology, Western astrology, as we can sort of call it. There are other systems of prediction based on the sky. I think Mesoamerican cultures also have it, but it's very different. I don't know if we can call it an astrology, and I'm not sure if it would be applied in the same way. So it's really not a different type of astrology. It's only later on in the 20th century where we hear about all these variations of Celtic astrology and other stuff like that. But that's something that was created, sometime in the 20th century or late 19th, just for the romantic aspect of it. I don't think it ever existed originally.
What about in the Bible? Does astrology or astrological concepts show up anywhere in Scripture? And do we know anything about how Jewish culture in Jesus' day would have thought about astrology?
Complex question. I'll try to answer to the best of my abilities. Here we have to distinguish two things. As I said earlier, astrology is part of the cosmology of the ancient world, of pre-modern cosmology. So it will appear in the Bible, and it does appear when you're referencing every time they are referencing the structure of the universe, you will see that the same principles apply to astrology in the Bible. There are a couple of mentions. You have the most famous one, the Star of Bethlehem, and the 3 mages, or the mages, because we don't really know if they're 3, and that's a whole other story, more complex. But the mages, and that reference to a star that would announce the Savior, that's an astrological idea there. It's difficult to say if there are theories that was a specific conjunction of planets. Some people say it was a comet. There are several theories. There are several interesting articles and papers by academics on what that star could be. So there is a reference to astrology there. And Jewish people would have used astrology. So they inherited astrology not only from the Middle Eastern area where they were part of, but also from the Roman Empire and the commerce with Greece, where most of astrology was done. So they would apply astrology, and there are certain references in Jewish scripture about astrology and things that relate to astrology. Of course, it's always a bit vague, and you don't have a straightforward astrological thing there, possibly because of scriptural reasons, theological reasons. Because, as you know, astrology is not accepted all the time by the people of the book, religions of the book.
So when Christian culture began, when Christian theology began, there was very quickly all of this borrowing from Greek and Roman cultures and non-Christian cultures in general. How would those early Christian thinkers have regarded astrological ideas that, were woven into Greco-Roman philosophy, for instance, or literature? Was astrology condemned at that time the way some Christian groups condemn astrology today?
I'm not an expert on that topic specifically. What I know from my research is that very early on, I don't know the earliest groups, how they would see it, but early on, what we call now the church fathers most of them are going to renounce astrology or go against astrology. And there are several reasons for that. One is that astrology uses the planets and the signs of the zodiac and other systems which are named after the Greco-Roman gods. So by using those systems, you would be perpetuating that idea of the gods associated with the stars. And that was a problem. And you see that in early writings, in the same way that you see, for example, a prohibition of having masses under trees, because that could be confused with any kind of pagan ritual, which was usually done outside, near nature. So you have that kind of sentiment where you're not going to use this kind of systems because these systems are tainted with the old religion from which we are trying to detach from. So that's a practical, I would think, approach to the problem. The other one is theological, which is the assumed ability of astrology to predict the future. And that creates a very big problem with free will. Free will is a staple of Christianity. So if you are able to predict something, then that means that somehow that was already set. It was predestined. If it's predestined, then that goes against free will. And this is the big theological fight we see between Christianity and astrology. So, and you're going to see that in the writings of Augustine. Augustine is the author that's going to, at least the most well-known of them, that's going to discuss this extensively, where he says that astrology goes against the free will. So if there's astrology, if astrology works, then there's no free will. So if assuming that free will is a thing because there's a belief in Christianity, then astrology could not work in the way that people assume it works. So they're either lying, and I'm simplifying this a lot. They're either lying or they are being influenced willingly or unwillingly by demonic forces, which are giving them the correct answers. So that's going to be the big theological fight between Christianity and astrology.
So moving forward in time to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, there were a lot of thinkers and writers who started to draw on ideas or symbols from astrology. Like Dante, there's a lot of astrological language in the Divine Comedy, right? So this is another big question, but how did kind of other Catholic theologians of the time kind of start to wrestle with that as it showed up more just kind of in culture overall?
I think for a long time, and I would say almost until Renaissance, this uncomfortable coexistence of astrology and Christianity exists in silence. That's a silent war, There are things that are not allowed, but mostly are priests that are going to carry on the practice of astrology and the study of astrology. So it's there. There are limits to it, but no one's arguing that. So you see it very easily being mixed. And early on, there's this idea that there is a natural astrology. So where the influences that the heavenly bodies have on the planet, on the earth, are going to be understood. And you can use that for meteorology, for crops, also for natural things that do not affect free will. But then there's always a gray area where you're going to have that apply to humans, and that's going to be the complicated parts. When you get to the Renaissance, of course, you have this flourishing of Greco-Roman thought, which is going to bring again the gods and all of that. But for example, what you see in Dante, it is astrological, but it's mostly cosmological. So what you're seeing him, and then he describes the different heavens with the planets and the spheres of the planets, it's more cosmological than astrological. Of course, he talks about the planets and rulerships of the planets, which are astrological elements, but they are inserted in a cosmology. So it is in a line of that which is permissible, because at that time, people were not questioning that the stars would influence the material world. That was not into question. What was into question is how much you could perceive that influence to predict the future. And that is the big problem. So as long as you're not doing any predictions, you're just describing the world as it is in their eyes, that's not a problem. And that's why Dante doesn't have a lot of backlash. Well, so another complex story.
So you've written about this topic, specifically about the distinction between astrology as a kind of deterministic system, as you call it, versus a symbolic or a spiritual language. Could you explain that distinction a bit?
Yeah. Astrology has to do in its core with the order of the world, how the world is ordered. So, in that sense, it explains, at least it would explain in the eyes of the ancient, how this world would be structured. And God would be above all of that because he's the creator, so he created the world as it is, and that's a very and then that gives some structural reassurance, and that is connected with spirituality, as again we see in Dante, as he sort of creates that mirror image between the heavens, the celestial heavens, and the circles of hell. Like there was a mirror image of something celestial with something which is of the underworld. So in that sense, things are perceived in a spiritual sense. How it's the nature of existence itself. When you start to go to the deterministic aspect, and where you are predicting things, then it can go to the very mundane, and sometimes to the ridiculous, where you're selecting times for everything. You don't do anything without a certain configuration appearing. And that is, of course, the extreme of the predictive aspect that astrology claims, and which we still see today, when people believe in the daily horoscopes and that kind of media that it existed in some form in the ancient times, and it still does.
So when you were talking about Dante and how he kind of used these images, he was describing the world as it is. It is true that the stars do things at certain times, and there are certain times when you have to plant crops, or when there are parallels there, to me it seems, between kind of using the stars in that way and how we Catholics think about the liturgical calendar. Right? There are certain times of the year when we light the Advent wreath, or on Palm Sunday, we have these rituals that are around this calendar, around these events. Do you think that's kind of an accurate parallel to make? Are there parallels there at all?
In a certain way, because most of the events we see in religions, Catholic or otherwise, are determined by seasons or by a calendar, and the calendar is determined by the sun and the moon, so there's a celestial element there. Like Easter, for example, I think it's the most obvious of them all, connected with the new moon, or the full moon in this case, and the full moon in the sign of Aries, so the first spring full moon. So there is this cycle, and I think in all religions and all spiritualities there is this need for cyclical engagement with the world, as we have biologically. If we want to go in that way, we're hot in the summer, so we act differently. In the winter, we act differently because it's cold, and the light is less than in the summer. So I think all religions echo that to one extent or the other. So there is a parallel to those rituals, to that sequence of rituals. Some of them are more connected with seasons and stars and movements, calendrical movements, I would say. Others less, because things get different and sophisticated as history proceeds. But yes, I would say that there's some sort of parallel.
Today, Catholics have a range of views on astrology. Some Catholics are curious about it and may feel attracted to it. Others are cautious, and some are, terrified of it. They're afraid that it's spiritually dangerous. Is there a way that astrology could kind of open up spiritual questions in a way that doesn't replace or threaten faith? And, is it spiritually dangerous to do astrology or read horoscopes?
As a Catholic, well, technically, yes. Let's go with the basis. So, if you believe truly in free will, and that is a staple, because without free will, sin or guilt or redemption don't make sense, because if everything is determined, how can you be guilty of a sin because you were predestined to make it? So there's a problem there. So if you go in a very predictive sense, and you believe in everything that's is going to happen has to do with movements of planets and stars, then yes, that can be dangerous. And in a Catholic way, yes, very. And that's what the Church always tried to avoid people getting into. And you can see that very early on. Otherwise, if you understand it in a more natural way, and I'm using here theological correct terms, in more natural ways, as a sort of normal cycles of time, and that certain things and certain larger things that we are involved in do follow those larger circles of time, then there's less danger, because it doesn't have to do with personal destiny or free will, but with the natural flow of things. It's a very complicated question. I hope I make any sense.
No, I think this is, I mean, the point of these episodes and the podcast in general is to have complicated answers to questions. So,
Yeah.
Which kind of brings me to our final question. We always close by asking, what is one thing that you really want people to take away from this conversation when it comes to kind of understanding the topic as a whole?
So I think what is important here from a Catholic point of view is to understand the subject, because people tend to hear very simplistic explanations on things and get frightened, about certain menaces without really thinking lots of things. And this has been thought out throughout the ages. So people should try to understand it. And if people like astrology and want to engage with it, they should try to understand it and then try to understand what are the limits, which their religious beliefs allows them to practice astrology or to engage with astrology. And I think that's the most important thing. And once you're okay with that and you find a balance between your beliefs and any practice of astrology, then things work out well. It's when you act upon with fear or ignorance and with extremes, as always, that things get complicated and sort of slip the wrong way, or tend to slip the wrong.
Well, that's all our questions. Thank you so much for this conversation.
I'm glad you invited me. Pleasure.
This conversation opened up so many different ways of thinking about astrology, why people have used it, and also why there are warnings against it.
Was there anything in the conversation that surprised you?
I think the fact that I went into this conversation thinking that astrology was just silly. I was convinced by by him talking about the fact that astrology actually can be dangerous a little bit, right?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to unpack that a little bit more. I think part of I have a habit of reacting when people get, I don't know, hysterical or superstitious about something. My response is often to be like, it's not a big deal. So, for years, I've just kind of like laughed off people implying that my entirely casual, entertaining interest in astrology could be a problem. And I've actually been thinking about this, how dangerous that is. And I think even when you're not taking it that seriously, when you're making decisions based on something that has nothing to do with your actual engagement in the lived experience in the world today, or the ethics of how you should act with other human beings and with your community.
Yeah, I also thought it was interesting, and had never thought about this before. He made this differentiation between astrology that's just part of the rhythm of life. Right? The stars move across the heavens. People notice that. That is a scientific fact. And there are things that you do based on the position of that stars. You plant crops. We are very used to and comfortable in Catholicism with this sense of a cycle of time. And then there's the sort of astrology, like you say, that you're using to make decisions that kind of stands apart from the fact that people have watched the stars as long as there have been people. And I think that was surprising to me, that I just kind of thought Christianity, anti-astrology.
This past summer, when my sister was visiting, we spent a lot of time just stargazing and trying to figure out the constellations while we were just having conversations and things. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what it must have been like in a much earlier time without the technology we have today, and how the stars would have been, first of all, brighter, and they would have stood out so much, not just visually, but in terms of these are important parts of your life experience. They're moving, they're in shapes. We're not entirely sure how far away they are, how they're moving. And there's something I think kind of beautiful about the fact that people sought to understand their interconnectedness with the heavenly bodies. And I think there's a real difference between that and, looking to see what your horoscope is and saying, well, today I should try to make a business deal or my date's going to go badly.
Yeah, I mean, even the fact that they didn't even have the frame of reference that the stars are moving because the Earth is moving. So why are these stars moving? What's going on? Right? Like it really was a way for them to try to make sense of this phenomenon that they were observing with their eyes.
Yeah, and I think that's so different from some of I guess, the hysteria, you could call it, around astrology, that people were summoning demons or believing in pagan gods, and the pagan gods were really demons. And I think that that viewpoint really obliterates that sense of human awe before mystery. I think it's much more real if we recognize that, 3,000 years ago, people were not doing something evil. They were doing something profound, something deeply human, which is, again, not to say that it's not a problem to pursue it in the same way today with all that we have learned since then. Actually, I don't think we could pursue it in the same way. We don't look at the world in the same way. Was there anything that you felt you wanted to ask more information about?
I think we talked a little bit about other traditions outside of kind of the ancient Near East and then the church. I would love to learn more about kind of other astrologies and how they differed from the philosophies that he was talking about.
Yeah, I think that would be really cool. And I feel like there's probably a vast number of cultural traditions out there I'm not even aware of. Different African and South American and Asian traditions. I would be very curious just to see simple things like, do they have a different name for what we call the Ursa Major? How do they see the patterns? How did other cultures interpret those patterns?
So yeah, I think because I had not really thought about this before, as we were talking, I was like, oh, I now want to learn more about what other cultures thought and believed and how they thought about their place in the heavens. And obviously, like we didn't have time to get into any of that.
Yeah, that would be super cool. I wanted to There's so much astrology in medieval European literature, and I find that really interesting because today we have this idea as Catholics, astrology bad. Like there's a scene in the Purgatorio in the Divine Comedy where one character, Marco Lombardo, basically lays out a philosophy of astrology. He's like, the stars don't control anything, but they influence you. They influence your character, but you still have free will. And yet at the same time in Inferno, the astrologers there are being punished, but they're being punished specifically for fraud, that they deceived people by reading their horoscopes and telling them stuff that wasn't true and taking their money. And I thought that was a really interesting distinction coming out of a very deeply Catholic tradition, that, honoring free will, but also recognizing that the world we live in forms who we are, shapes our character and our inclinations. Whether the stars are doing it or not is another matter.
So our last question is: if you were going to write a sermon, what would the topic of your sermon be?
So I think my sermon would be to remind people that the choices that we make in life need to be based on the good. They need to be based on what is the outcome of this going to be for others in your life, for others in your community, for the entire network of all living beings. And when you're consulting signs and wonders and oracles, you're not looking at reality anymore. I would even perhaps say that God has written messages for us on creation, and those messages are not necessarily to be found in the stars, but in that moment of moral obligation where you're called to be like God by loving those who are most vulnerable in your community.
I just keep thinking about the cyclical nature of time and how that connects to our own liturgical calendar. And just like nature has its rhythms, so does our faith. And I think there's something that parallel is a really interesting way to talk about why we look for patterns and the importance of the liturgical life, because there is something like so deep and beautiful about that that is reflected in the natural world.
And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast, or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Are you a big astrology buff? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us for next week's episode.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to share a special offer for Glad You Asked listeners. Glad You Asked podcast is a project of U.S. Catholic Magazine, which is published by the USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries. This season, we're offering listeners 25% off a print or digital subscription to U.S. Catholic. Subscribe now and see why the Catholic Media Association recently named us the best Catholic general interest magazine for the 4th year in a row. To claim this special offer, visit uscatholic.org/GYA subscribe.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Sana, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. We're produced by Stephanie Clary and Joki Mercuria, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.